awards, but that really, that's in a way, it speaks to how important this book is, because what it does is that it offers a very new method, it offers a very new perspective on how we understand ourselves. I mean, when we think of who we are, when we ask ourselves who are Indians, who are we as Indians, we usually don't often think of the prehistory, as it were. So we don't often think of ourselves in this kind of much longer span of time. We don't, and this book kind of offers us a very fact-based way of locating ourselves in this very long history, indeed this very long prehistory. So the first question to you, Tony, would be, you wrote this book in 2018. I mean, it came out in 2018. You've been writing this book for the last decade or more. And this also happens to be the 100th year of Rakhaldas Bandopadhyay's discoveries in Mohenjo-daro. So it's kind of a significant year to be talking about in this year. But this book came out in 2018, and it really comes across as a book that is sparked off by a very sort of deep-seated curiosity. So was there a single question that sparked it off? Did you have multiple questions that you wanted to answer? So what were the germs of this book, as it were?
It started with what seemed to me then like a fairly manageable question, which I was trying to answer, which is who were the Harappans and where did they disappear? We have all read about the Harappan civilization in our school textbooks, but it had never been convincingly answered. Why did they disappear? Did they have something to do with us? So I thought I will look at research across multiple fields that has happened in recent years and see if we can find a better answer to that question. Then you realize that you can't really answer who the Harappans were unless you understand who the first farmers of India were, because the Harappan civilization grew out of the first emergence of agriculture in northwestern India.
Right.
And you can't answer who the first farmers are unless you answer who the first Indians were. So the question kept becoming larger and larger and larger. And it looked like 2 or 3 years into the work, it really looked like this project is never going to get done, because there's a sea of information to cross. And so in this process, I began with meeting people who had going to all the Harappan civilizational sites in India, meeting people, the scientists and academics who had written papers on the civilization, and that's how it started.
Wonderful. I think, even when we were studying the Harappan civilization in school, this question was there. I mean, how did the Harappan civilization disappear? But I don't think it bothered me as much as it didn't seem like a question that I could even answer or that I could hope to answer. And it's wonderful that you thought of this and then kind of traced it back, to what, 700,000 years? Longer, maybe.
About 65,000 years
about
ago
65,000
in India.
years ago, right. So that's a long way to trace a single question back in history. In your book, just to kind of, give a broader sense of the narrative that you weave together, you speak of 4 classes of migration that were influential in shaping the Indian demography. So would you like to speak a little bit about that, about the 4 classes of migration?
In the last few years, what we have got clarity is not just about how the Indian subcontinent got peopled, but how the entire world got peopled. And when you talk about the 4 classes of migrations, you are not talking about the Indian subcontinent alone, you are talking about the entire globe. We are talking about the entire Earth that got populated. So now we know, and this is not a perspective that we could have had even 10 or 15 years ago, because this is based on more recent understanding of peopling of the world based on ancient DNA research. That is DNA collected from people who lived thousands or tens of thousands of years ago.
Right.
The four classes of migrations are to be, the first class of migrations are what are called out of Africa migration, that started around 70,000 years ago, when a band of modern humans from Africa, probably not numbering more than a few hundred, moved out of Africa into the Arabian Peninsula, and then over the following thousands of years went on to people the whole of the world. The last continent they reached was the Americas. That is probably around 16,000 years ago. So between around 70,000 years ago, 70, and 16,000 years ago is when the whole world got populated. So the answer to the question, who were the first Indians, who were the first Japanese, who were the first Americans, who were the first Europeans, who were the first Australians, the answer is all just the same. They're all out of Africa migrants who reached these places at different points in time. So this is the first class of migrations, defined or shaped by what can be called climatic factors, depending on when the glacial age began, ended, when various routes became available, etc. The second class of migrations is of a very different nature. This happened when, after the glacial age, modern humans in different parts of the world started experimenting with agriculture.
Right.
It did not start in one place. People in different parts tried various kinds of experimentations with agriculture. Not all of them were successful. For example, one of the earliest groups to take to agriculture were people in Southeast Asia who domesticated bananas and tubers and things like that, but these are not very productive. So it didn't change their lifestyle. But people who were in especially four major regions, Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, and China, were lucky in that in the regions where they were, they had wild varieties of cereal to domesticate, and they are very productive. Once you start domesticating and starting agriculture, then they changed their lifestyle. They became farmers from hunter-gatherers. And farmer populations, when you settle down, grow at a much faster rate than hunter-gatherers. So when people take to agriculture, what happens is that there is a population explosion, and then that leads to migrations that then change the demography in all the nearby regions. And these are things that happen over thousands of years. So it's not, these migrational classes that we talk about are not things that are a flash in the pan, not something that lasts a few years or a decade or even a century. These are things that lasted for thousands of years. So this second class of migrations, which you can call, is the result of man's mastery over nature to the extent of figuring out how to do agriculture, that caused migrations that changed the demography of the world for over thousands of years. This is the second class of migrations, agriculture-related migrations. The third class of migrations happened when a group of modern humans in Central Asia mastered the art of metallurgy, wheels, and the art of riding the horse, and all of this together changed the way that they changed their mobility. They could move far faster than modern humans at any point of time prior to this period. And these people from Central Asian steppe, vast grasslands, moved across all of Eurasia, Europe and Asia, changing the demography across, at the one hand, on the westernmost side, Iceland, to the easternmost, you could say the Indian subcontinent, or to use current terms, Bangladesh. This is the large period, that area that they changed the demography, spreading Indo-European languages. So this is the third class of migrations, which is a result of man's mastery over mobility.
Right.
And the fourth class of migrations happened in much more recent times, which our grandparents would probably still remember, which is the colonial migrations, which started when a small group of people in Europe figured out how to travel large distances over the seas, and they could move into the areas that are populated. and changed the demography. It happened in the Americas, in Australia, in various other parts of the world. So these are the 4 classes of migrations that changed world demography, out of which one of them had very little impact on India, which is the colonial migrations, because the number of migrants who reached here were too small, too few in number compared to the existing population. So they had virtually no impact on Indian population formation. So to understand Indian population formation, you have to understand the other 3 classes of migrations. And out of those 3 classes of migrations, there are actually 4 migrations, because there are 2 agricultural related migrations that happened that shaped Indian demography. One from the West and one from East Asia, as a result of China taking to agriculture and a group of people moving across East Asia and reaching India after about 4,000 years ago.
Thanks for summing that up in such an elegant manner, just kind of, because it's a long history. I mean, it's almost incomprehensible in the terms in which we understand our past. Again, thinking back to the session that we were having just before this, which relates to water shortage and generally, the impact of the climate change on the human civilization. I'm wondering whether, if you are speaking of it in terms of, say, tens of thousands of years, is there any way that I, as an individual, can be aware of a change that we may be undergoing right now, even as we speak? Because this would not have been perceptible to an individual subject living a single life in that duration. So is it possible that there is a larger migration that's happening right now, or that may take place in the years to come that you anticipate?
We can speculate.
Yeah.
But it is historians 100 or 200 or a few hundred years in the future who will have to say whether we are currently seeing a 5th class of major migrations. We can speculate what is driving it. As we said, even all the 4 classes of migration, they had specific factors that drove those migrations over very large periods of time. We could look at where we are today and say that it's possible that there is a 5th class of migrations that is happening today, driven by 2 things. One is differences in population growth between different regions and differences in economic prosperity. Both these things could be causing large population movements today that could last for a very long period of time and change world demography again. And this is related to climate, because climate changes can change economic prosperity.
Absolutely.
So in that sense, it acts through these 2 factors, which is economic prosperity and population growth. And we'll have to wait and see how long this continues and whether this will change global demography again.
I'm just wondering, would you sort of think of, again, it's speculative now, I understand that, and we'll have better understanding of this decades on and centuries on. But do you think that even the 4th wave that you mentioned, which is colonialism, do you think that is also motivated by similar factors? Because I'm just trying to understand, say, how this would relate to the idea of the Anthropocene, which is becoming more and more, which is coming into circulation more and more. So do you see that maybe if we look at it in these substantial chunks of time, do you see there's any connection between colonial migration and what's happening now, or are these?
All of these have lasting tails, but long tails of impact, right? We have not yet done with the result of modern humans taking to agriculture yet.
Yeah.
We are still seeing the effects of that. The same for everything else that has happened. So I think it would be correct to say that each of those migrations, each of those changes that happened, including the colonial ones, have long tails that impact our history, and including climate, because I think changes in the basic factors, in this case, the ability to move large distances overseas and move into areas already well populated and dominate them because of your mastery over the seas.
Right.
That had a very large number of consequences.
Thanks. Thank you so much for that. I mean, you started off, like you said, with a single question of what happened to the Harappans, and then you kind of traced this very long prehistory. But the book that you write, it has, the reason why it's been so widely read and appreciated is that it also answers some very significant questions that relate to our present day of how we understand ourselves in the world. And I'll come to the more specific questions later, but it also has this kind of a philosophical import where it decenters the understanding that we have of ourselves. So would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, one of the fascinating things when for me to realize has been that we understand the world often by putting ourselves in the center of things. We can't understand the world without putting ourselves at the center of things. Whether it is that the place we inhabit, almost all cultures have seen the places that they inhabit as the center of the world. They have seen their own tribes, communities, nations as somehow special children of God, or given some mandate to rule over everyone else, or with some special abilities which no one else has. The earth has been the center of the universe. So this is a long history of people imagining, and when modern humans, even in modern times, when the scientists first figured out that modern humans emerged at one point of time, even then the scientists thought that the modern humans, when they emerged, were far superior to other Homo species who were then around. And there was a watershed moment in terms of artistic expression and ability. Now we know that all that is bunkum. This is not true. Modern humans did not create a watershed moment in either creativity or intelligence or artistic expression. And during much of the time that they lived together, modern humans and other Homo species were almost indistinguishable. Some of them had even larger brains than the modern humans. So understanding actually what happened in the past makes us humble in some ways, and also makes us realize that we are we're connected to things that are much larger than ourselves.
Right. So, with your permission, the passage that you have in the book, I was thinking maybe it's worth reading it out. This is right at the beginning of the book where we are discussing what we understand by the modern human. And it always, fascinates me to try to think what the day of a Homo sapien would have been like meeting someone from the Homo erectus species. What would their conversation be like? But jokes aside, it's a really sort of powerful passage where he says, and this is true not just in a cosmic sense, but in a biological sense as well. Ever since Darwin shocked humanity a century and a half ago by formulating the theory of evolution and suggesting that our closest living relatives could be chimpanzees, every subsequent discovery has gone on to destroy the special status we had generously given ourselves previously. First, we thought that when we, the modern humans or Homo sapiens, arrived on the scene, there was a sudden and appreciable difference in the kind of tools that were being made, as well as an efflorescence of artistry and abstract thought. Now we know that all that was conceit, and that the tools made by us and those made by our closest evolutionary cousins, Homo erectus, Homo neanderthalensis, Denisovans, were often indistinguishable from each other, and that there was no watershed moment. And then you go on to write quite powerfully, none of these beliefs are true, of course. No human community is of exceptional status relative to others. None are children of God or chosen people, unless all are. And this kind of, it's a really sort of moving passage, and you don't really expect a book that is so densely packed with research and facts to suddenly, pull back and offer this kind of perspective. So it's a really sort of moving experience to read the way you frame this whole argument. In terms of the specific questions that I mentioned before, that this book answers, or at least, encourage us to, question our assumptions around questions. One, of course, is that of when we speak of the early Indians, who were the Aryans, and where did the caste system begin? Because that again is a question of this this mistaken notion of centrality, of significance, of assuming a special status of one group of people over another. So when we think of these two, I mean, let's first address the question of the Aryans coming to India, and what the findings from prehistory tell us about that.
These are two different questions, even though they are often seen together. The arrival of people from the Central Asian steppe region who brought Indo-European languages to India, now we know happened between around 2000 BCE and 1500 BCE. That's about 500 years. That's the period over which these migrations happened.
Right.
Why can't it have happened beyond or after 1500 BCE? Because we now know, because of ancient DNA, that the populations in the Central Asian steppe region significantly changed with new movements of people from East Asia, and that if migrations had continued from Central Asia after 1500 BCE, we should be able to see that new genetic movements that had happened, which we do not see. So it is now clear that the migrations happened between 2000 BCE and 1500 BCE. And now the second part, the caste system. Usually the assumption has been that the caste system began with the arrival of the Central Asian steppe migrants who called themselves Aryan. But now we know is that this is not true. This is from, again, genetic research. Studies have shown that until 100 BCE, that's about more than 1,500 years after the migrations happened, there was significant mixing of people. Of all the migrations, we talked about four migrations that happened. So let us just imagine what happened between 2000 BCE and about the beginning of the Common Era. That's a period of about 2,000 years. The first, we know that the Harappan civilization started declining around 1900 BCE.
Right.
So the largest civilization of its time, as big as the Egyptian and Mesopotamian civilizations put together in terms of area and in terms of people, and which lasted for 700 years, fell apart because of long drought that affected all civilizations of its time, and its people moved. This itself would have been the most stressful period for any region, but that was just the beginning of it. As the people were moving towards east to North India, south to South India, from the Harappan civilization region, there were new migrants coming in from East Asia, what we talked about as the long tail of the Chinese agriculture-related migration that came through and brought Austroasiatic languages, which are today present in Central India and Eastern India, such as Khasi and Mundari, which are related to languages today spoken in East Asia. But it didn't end there either. Then came, between 2000 and 1500 BC, another major group of migrants from Central Asia, who had far greater mobility and who obviously dominated the northern Indian part of the region, and causing a language shift from pre-Aryan languages into Indo-Aryan languages in northern India. So these are all the things that happened. So you can't imagine, there is no other period in Indian history. If anybody were to ask you what is the most tumultuous period in the Indian history that you can think of, there's nothing anywhere near comparable to between 2000 BCE and the beginning of the Common Era, because these are all the things that happened for such a long time. And amidst all this, what is happening underneath is mixing of the people. To such an people mixed. This is something that This is something that we forget. People often think that migrations happen. There is what the natural result of migrations usually is mixing of people, mixing of cultures, borrowals, adaptations, adoptions. All of that is the natural process when large migrations happen over long periods of time. So this mixing is so over such a long period of time happened to the extent that today, no matter how remote a region you go to, in whichever part of the subcontinent, you will still find all populations are mixed. So that is the extent to which it happened. If you have to find a population which did not mix anywhere near as much as this suggests, you have to go to that part of India which is completely disconnected from the mainland, that is Andaman Islands, because that didn't see all of these for migrations that we talked about. So they did mixed less. Of course, after the British arrived, they took a lot of people to those islands, so the mixing has happened after that. So this is the kind of mixing that happened. So therefore, to suggest that the caste system began with the arrival of the Arya is not true. And this we know from the earliest Sanskrit literature itself, because in the Rig Veda you talk about the rishis, major rishis whose mothers were not Aryan. So there was a mixing that itself, and the quote that is mentioned from the Rig Veda, the Purusha Sukta that talks about the 4 different classes, it's itself considered a much later interpolation to justify the system. So so it is possible that when the migrations happened, a small subset of the new coming migrants might have refrained from mixing as much as the rest of them did. But by and large, the migrations resulted in very major mixing between all classes of people. And genetic research suggests that this mixing slowly came to an end around 100 BCE. This is stunning. Absolutely. Because people who were mixing fairly dramatically, and you say that around 100 CE, mixing slowly comes to an end, and we see the emergence of endogamy, which is the practice of communities marrying within themselves, which you can see from the genetic record. So by the time endogamy is set in, which is often regarded as the distinguishing feature of the caste system, around 2000 years ago, people had already mixed. So to differing extents, whenever you say mixing, it doesn't mean that the mixing happened it would have happened in different regions, different parts, to differing extents. But the fact is that today, no matter what caste hierarchy, where in the caste hierarchy you stand, what language you speak,
what food you eat, because that's also something
what food you eat, what class you are. I mean, wherever you stand in the various hierarchies, you all carry the maximum ancestry that we all carry in South Asia, not just in the Republic of India, is the ancestry of the first Indians who reached here 65,000 years ago. So that's the... so the caste system arose, it leaves... From genetics, we know when the caste system arose, around 2000 years ago, around 100 CE. But the question, why did it arise then? That's not a question that genetics can answer. That requires a different set of disciplines to answer that question. Since we know when it began, I think this question has to be freshly looked at from all other angles.
Thank you for clarifying that. Because while reading the book, I mean, one thing that Tony kind of keeps reminding you of is that there is no kind of deterministic hubris in the methodology, in the sense that it doesn't say that this is the final. I mean, it is the final word in genetics, sure, but you keep mentioning that this must be understood in relation to other disciplines and other areas of research. For instance, you mention, particularly in the Harappa chapters, the importance that archaeology and linguistic histories have in how we understand the Harappan civilization.
Yeah.
So what you do in terms of marshalling this very diverse body of research is really exceptional. So I was wondering if you would, I mean, now that we have kind of discussed the thematic of the book and its contents, it's also interesting for us to, I think, ask about the method of how you went about, gathering this information. So maybe first I could ask you how you went about, because it requires training to read this research, because you constantly keep updating your work from the last, I mean, even in the last 4 years, there are significant sort of discoveries that, come into your book. So what was this process like of training yourself to read genetics research, of, gathering all of these sources? How did that go about?
It was tough, especially genetics. It took a lot of time to figure this out. And I think what helped me was the fact that I had access to, and the scientists and the academics involved spend hours and hours of their time. These are leaders in their fields, doyens in the field from around the world, answering questions from a person who is not part of their discipline, and therefore is trying to understand. I think that was critical, and still it took a lot of time. Part of the reason why it took me 6 years to write the book is precisely this. When I say that it took 6 years to write this book, people often assume it is on top of other things, as it normally is, but it's not on top of other things. I'd given up everything else by then. 6 years is 6 years devoted to writing this book. And the fascinating thing is that the first thing that you need to understand is that different disciplines have different starting points, different methodologies, different assumptions. So you can't merely mix and match as you wish.
Absolutely.
Results from one discipline to another. I will just explain by one example.
Yes.
If you ask archaeologists, when did the first modern humans arrive in India? Many of them will probably say maybe 100,000 years ago, 120,000 years ago. If you ask a geneticist, you can be reasonably certain that nobody will say more than 70,000 years ago or 65,000 years ago. So it would look like a dramatic contradiction between these two disciplines. How do we? But you have to realize, once you understand what the starting assumptions are and what the methodologies are, you realize that these are not really contradictory. They are answering different questions. The archaeologists are looking at evidence left behind by modern humans,
Right.
like tools and other things, and then answering. It looks like they were here by around 120,000. Geneticists don't look at archaeological things left behind. They look at the genetic track record of people. And what the question they are answering is that, when do you think the ancestors of people who are currently in India, when did they first arrive here?
Right.
These two things need not be the same thing. It could be that the first modern humans to arrive here were 120,000 years ago, but they all got wiped out through a volcanic eruption or something else, or a disease or whatever. They did not leave behind a genetic lineage.
Right.
So these two things need not be contradictory. So once you understand disciplines from and the different starting assumptions they make, then it becomes easier to understand what they mean.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, that's an incredible kind of, flexibility to also train with, because it can't be easy to piece together these at the end of it. I think we are running out of time. Before we go into the questions and answers, just one final question to you, which is, the import of your book. It definitely kind of makes us rethink where we are in the world. But as we know, human beings are often peculiarly fact resistant, in the sense that we may be confronted with information, but it does not really change the way that we see ourselves, change the way that we understand our privileges, change the way that we understand ourselves in relation to other communities. So do you think that there is any way that that the discoveries that you make in your book or the suggestions that you offer in your book can be translated into something which impacts the way, I mean, how does that translation happen between the facts and the transformative potential of an argument?
I think it's an interesting question, and I think research has again and again shown that once people have taken a stance on an issue that is related to identity, that no amount of reason, logic is going to change that. Because it is very painful, extremely painful to change stances that you have taken
Absolutely.
on issues that are related to identity. And many of these questions that are related to history, our ancient history in particular, often get caught up in identity issues. And therefore, it may not be reasonable to expect that reason and logic would therefore settle all of these questions, because identity questions are tremendously resistant to reason and logic.
True.
Therefore, the question is that not everybody has thought about these issues and made up their mind. Only a few people have made up their mind on identity-related issues. There are a lot of people who have not yet made up their mind.
Absolutely.
Reason and logic is something that helps them make up their mind, and many of them would be young. So what do we do about people who have made up their minds and reason and logic is not a path to reach them? I think that's where art has a lot of role to play.
Yeah.
Empathy, these are other things that you can deal with to reach where reason and logic can't reach. Art often can.
Thanks for that. And just to kind of bring this discussion to a close, without, there is no spoiler alert as such, but I'll just read a passage from the closing section of the book where you ask, so who are we Indians really? And you say the best way we can define ourselves is as a multi-source civilization, not a single source one, drawing its cultural impulses, its traditions, and its practices from a variety of heredities and migration histories. And then you go on to list some of these changes, and then you say beliefs and practices that have reshaped our society in fundamental ways, and those who came even later seeking refuge or conquest or for trade, and those who chose to stay, all have mingled and contributed to this civilization we called Indian. We are all Indians, and we are all migrants. So wonderful sort of reminder about who we are, about the question of who migrants are, which has also become terribly important in the last few years. So with that, I'll bring this session to a close and open it out for questions in case there are members in the audience who would like to ask. Yes, I see someone raising their hand at the back.
You spoke of two things. One was the Chinese incoming 4,000 years back, and the second was Khasi being similar to, as a language, to East Asian. Is there any other proof of people coming 4,000 years back from China? Because Khasi, yes. I don't believe that is dated.
Genetic evidence. Recent genetic evidence has shown movement of people from the Chinese mainland that changed demography and spread across Southeast Asia. They did not have ancient DNA from India itself, but the language connects all of these regions.
Thank you, sir. Any other question from the audience? I see a hand up over here and gentleman in red over there.
Hi, I have a question on India's current situation, which is sort of unity in diversity, which we keep on talking about as a very unique aspect of this country. Now, has your research shown how we got to this particular state, which we keep on saying is very unique as compared to some of the other countries in the world?
Two things I Yeah, the entire book is actually the details about the four major migrations that shaped Indian demography. Four major migrations out of Africa migrations, number one, the agriculture related migrations from that, when once agriculture took off in northwestern India, and that changed demography when they moved everywhere. That's the second class of migrations. Third class of migrations are the East Asian, what we just talked about. And fourth class of migrations are the Central Asian ones. These are the four migrations that shaped Indian demography, and that's what the book talks about. Then you might ask, what about all the other migrations that happened later? The Huns, the Huns, the Arabs, the Persians, the Portuguese, the British, the Jews. I mean, there's a whole range of invasions that we read in history. The short answer is that they're all too small compared with the existing population to cause a large change in our demography. So they did not change our demography. Some of those migrations or invasions did change or impacted our culture, definitely. But they did not leave a demographic impact. So now to answer your question, the unity and diversity, yes, that's a very accurate description of India. There is no better description of India than unity and diversity. But I must also say that all large populations in all parts of the world are a result of multiple migrations that happened over prehistory, over history. So to say that we are a product of multiple migrations is not necessarily unique. That applies to all populations. All existing populations are mixtures of previous populations that existed, which themselves are mixtures of other populations that existed. Europe, for example, now we know, in just the last 10,000 years, has gone through three major, at least two major overhauling of their demography. First, a population of agriculturists from West Asia moved into Europe, mixing with, to some extent, and replacing to a significant extent the existing hunter-gatherer population of Europe 9,000 years ago. 5,000 years ago, a population from the Central Asian steppe region, the same people that we talked about in relation to the migrations into India later, they moved into Europe, mixed with, to some extent, replaced to a large extent, the existing farmer populations of Europe, as well as whatever remained of the original hunter-gatherer populations. So this is the story of all population groups everywhere. They're all mixtures.
There was one final question here. We'll just take that and draw this session to a close. Was there a hand raised roughly anywhere over here? If not, we can... Okay, so yeah, I think with that, we'll draw this session to a close. Thank you for being a wonderful and engaged audience. Thank you to the Tata Steel Kolkata Literary Meet and to the Victoria Memorial for hosting us. And thank you, of course, to Tony for this wonderful book. And I hope that, this becomes part of a longer discussion on genetics and... sorry? Oh, wonderful. So there's a book signing happening as well. So if any of you wish to meet Tony after that, or you have more questions, please feel free to follow up. Thank you and have a good afternoon.
Thank you, Sujan. Thank you, everyone.
নমস্কার টাটা স্টিল কলকাতা লিটারারি মিটের পঞ্চম দিনের প্রথম বাংলা সেশন সাংস্কৃতিক সঙ্গী ডাক